Awesome. Have a seat, everybody. It's good to see everybody. Yeah. All right, so those of you on Facebook Live, hi. It's good to see you. We love our Facebook Live family.
Yeah, we do.
So we're going to do something a little bit different as we get ready for Christmas. Okay, I haven't really done this, but we've been around, for going over 13 years now. And one of the things that I thought that I'd do this year in order to get our focus on getting ready for Christmas is this thing called an Advent candles, and what they are. And the whole idea of Advent candles have been around for a long time. Sometimes people put them in a wreath. And the word Advent actually means to prepare. That's what it means. And usually there's 4 candles. Sometimes there's 5, but usually there's 4. And each one of these represents an aspect of getting ready for Jesus' birth. The first one is hope. The next one's faith. The next one's joy. The next one is peace. All right, so tonight we're going to be focusing on this whole idea of hope. And so the story of Jesus actually begins before the singing of angels in the field when Jesus is born. This whole story of hope with Jesus starts before the arrival of the shepherds, starts before the arrival of the wise men, starts before the birth of Jesus himself. All right? In fact, it begins, this whole idea of hope and our faith and joy and peace actually starts 400 years before Jesus is even born. In fact, there's this verse in the book of Malachi. Malachi is right before Matthew. Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. And so in Malachi, listen to what this says in Malachi chapter 4, starting in verse 5. It says this, "Look, I am sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives. His preaching will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, the hearts of children to their fathers. Otherwise, I will come and strike the land with a curse." Okay, now listen. Those are the last words spoken about God for 400 years. Like after those words are spoken by Malachi, God is silent. Like there's no prophets. There's nobody talks about any words from God being spoken. There's like silence for 400 years. And when Malachi was talking about that, when he says, "I'm sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives," he's talking about there's this connection with Jesus coming, and then there's silence for 400 years. And during that time, Israel came under the oppression of Rome. It actually became a military state. So they were under this oppression. Those who loved God's law they lacked the power to change Israel's future. And so they just became, for 400 years, 4 generations removed from the last words that were spoken about God. And the rich and powerful Israelites, they actually saw no reason to trust God for anything. So 400 years goes by. And understandably, those that were hoping for the Messiah to come and the restoration of Israel, they finally lost You ever been there to lose hope? Anybody here ever lose hope in their life? It became an impossible situation for them. So you need to understand, like when this whole thing, when Jesus was getting ready, they were at the point, 4 generations, no words from God. They felt hopeless. Okay, so against this backdrop of oppression, okay, against that and hopelessness, we're going to find in the beginning of the book of Luke, that's where we're going to step into. Because during this series, we're going to look at some individuals that actually were a really crucial part of us understanding this whole idea of when Jesus being born, what he brought humanity. All right, so we're going to go to the book of Luke, and an elderly couple that was experiencing the tragedy of barrenness. Like, they don't have any kids. They don't have any hope of ever having kids. So this couple was Elizabeth and Zechariah. So Elizabeth and Zechariah, Zechariah was a faithful priest. They were a faithful, godly couple, but they didn't have any kids. And back then, like if you don't have any kids, that was considered that you were kind of cursed by God in that culture, all right? No hope for a child. And that was the scar that labeled them. And so that whole idea of having a child, that ship has sailed. They're older now. And so we're going to step into the story. They're about to learn some really important lessons about God in the midst of our brokenness. Okay? And the first thing that I want you to know in this, and we're going to see this, is that God sees me in my brokenness. God sees you in your brokenness. He is not unaware of that hopelessness that you feel. He's there. He sees you in the midst of your hopelessness. All right? And so here they are. You know, they're not going to have kids, but then God steps in, who's always full of surprises, and God decides it's time to get the ball rolling forward here towards Jesus' birth. So we're going to get the ball rolling here. And so God meets Zechariah in the middle of his mundane, everyday life. So you need to know some things about Zechariah. Okay, Zechariah was one of 20,000 priests that were around back then. So what there was like 20,000 priests. They were divided into 24 divisions in 4 or 9 different areas in all of Israel, okay? And those were divided into these, they would call these houses of 150 priests. Okay, that was what Zechariah, he was one of those, 150 in this group. In this area, they would call it a house. Okay, not a building, area, 150 priests. And so, and they would perform their duties throughout the week. For whatever like group they were around, like the temple that was around there, they would alternate. They would be at the temple for a week to perform their duties. Okay? And so, and they would find out what they were going to do by casting lots, which means they would throw dice, and wherever those lots were cast, that would determine what you would do that week. Okay, that was Zechariah's life. Every day, 365 days a year. Okay, that's just kind of what he did. Same thing every week, every month, every year. He was being faithful, but he was living in this hopelessness of never being able to have a child. Okay? So on this particular morning, okay, listen to this. On particular morning for Zechariah, something special was going to take place. Not just because the lots fell on Zechariah that day, but it wasn't just any duty. Okay, any duty. Today, he was going to go into what was called the holy place in the temple. And he was going to trim the wicks on the menorah or the lampstand. And he was going to light incense in front of the veil that covered what was called the most holy place. And what you need to understand is, if you're lucky as a priest, you'll do this once in your lifetime. Once in your lifetime. It fell to Zechariah on this day. All right? Because here's the other thing you need to understand about in the midst of your hopelessness is that God's timing is impeccable. Like he's setting this up. Like he knows that like the timing now is perfect. And so God, like in your life, like in the midst of your hopelessness, God intervening, God changing, whatever, God's timing is impeccable with this. All right? So I want you to kind of understand kind of what's happening here. Okay, so Zechariah is there. It's his day. He gets to go into the holy place. So he's out in the temple courtyard. And so I want you to kind of understand what happens before he goes in there. So while he's in the courtyard, there's two other priests that are stirring the pot of these hot coals. And so what would happen is Zechariah would come with this thing. This is the closest thing that I could find. But this is something that the two priests would dump these hot coals into this carrier. So they would dump all these coals in the carrier. And then Zechariah would enter into the holy place. Now, while he's doing that, there's a huge crowd around the temple. Huge crowd of people. And so he entered into the holy place, and then he would go to this next place on the menorah, and he would trim all the wicks on this menorah, this big, huge candle holder, right? That was part of his job. He would trim those wicks. Okay? And then he would walk up to the altar of incense, which I'll show you the next. This is the altar of incense. So he would walk up there with the altar of incense, and he would pour the hot coals on the altar. And then he had this little satchel, this little sack of powdered incense, and he would pour it on the coals. And so on this day, he did that. He walked up there, he put the coals on there, he took the incense, he poured it on the coals, and then you're supposed to kneel down immediately, your face to the ground, and then you're supposed to stand up and walk backwards out of the temple. Okay, that's kind of how it went. Okay? But except this time, God is going to have an appointment with Zechariah. So, and God is going to meet Zechariah and Elizabeth in the midst of their hopelessness, while getting ready to meet humanity's hopelessness. So this is all connected. So here's Zechariah. He's in there, right? In the midst of this. And this is what you need to understand. God wants to meet me in the midst of my hopelessness. God wants to meet you there. In the midst of your hopelessness. He doesn't want to stay like disconnected with you in the midst of your hopelessness. He wants to meet you there. A lot of times in the midst of our hopelessness, we think, where's God? Where did God go? Is he still here? Does he still care? He's not turning his back. He wants to meet you there. Okay, so Zechariah, he's in there. He just poured the incense on the altar of incense. Okay, and then what happens is an angel appears right next to that altar of incense. And Zechariah freaks out. Like anywhere, I don't know if you read this, but anywhere like in the Bible where people, like they encounter angels, you know what the first thing is that they say to the person? Don't be afraid. Now, I've never seen an angel. But I guarantee you, if you ever saw a real angel, it would freak you out. How they're described in the Bible in different ways. They're huge. They usually have weapons attached to them, like swords and stuff. So Zechariah is freaking at this point, all right? So we're going to step into this. Luke chapter 1, verse 13. Listen to what happens here. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth." Okay, so right here, God's saying, I'm about to meet you in your hopelessness. Right now, I'm going to meet you. For he will be great in the eyes of the Lord, and he must never touch wine or alcoholic drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. Remember what Malachi said? He will turn the hearts of their sons to their fathers. He will turn, remember? And then it says, he will be a man with the spirit and power of who? Elijah. That's exactly what Malachi was talking about 400 years earlier. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children. He will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly. Okay, so right after he says that, Zechariah basically says to the angel, yeah, right. Do you know how old we are? And then the angel says, whoa, 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 dude. Do you know who I am? I'm Gabriel, and I stand in God's presence. He's the one that sent me with the good news. Since you didn't believe me, you know what's going to happen, Zechariah? You're not going to be able to speak another word until your son John is born. Because when God decides to do something, it's going to happen. Yeah. And then the angel leaves. And because what was happening, people outside the temple, they were wondering why John wasn't coming out. He was in there for a while. They were a little concerned. So Zechariah comes out. He can't speak. He's kind of motioning with his hands, trying to explain to them. And at that point, they're like, uh-oh, we know what happened here. God did something. So Zechariah finishes his week of doing what he's going to do. He goes home. Elizabeth becomes pregnant for 9 months. Zechariah cannot speak. And people are rejoicing, right? They're hearing about what's going on. In fact, what is interesting, it says that Elizabeth went into solitude for 5 months. And I'm like, why would she do that? I think maybe she did that because she didn't want to get razzed by everybody. When she told them that she was pregnant, I'm sure they were going to go, yeah, right. How old are you? So she went into seclusion for 5 months. But after 9 months, she gives birth to a son. Okay? And people are rejoicing with Elizabeth. She had her baby. And so they go to Elizabeth and ask her, so what are you going to call your baby? You're going to call him Zechariah, right? She goes, no, I'm going to call him John. And they're like, what are you going to do that for? You don't have anybody in your family called John? And so they go to Zechariah. And they go, Zechariah, what are you going to name your son? And so he can't talk. He's like, so they get him a pen or a pencil or a pen quill, whatever they used. And he wrote the word John. And at that moment, when he was finished with the N in the word John, he could speak. And it was in that moment, Zechariah and Elizabeth come to grips with another truth about God in the midst of our hopelessness. Listen to this. Our impossibilities set the stage for God to do his best work. Our impossibilities set the stage for God to do his best work. By this time, Elizabeth and Zechariah had lost hope. We are never having a son. And God is like, oh yeah? I see you in your hopelessness. By the way, what's going to happen 33 years later? My son's going to bring hope. In fact, he's going to be born soon. And he's going to bring hope. As one of the theologians put it, as I was getting ready to this, listen to what he says. He says, it sets the stage for God to show his divine power, amazing grace, to triumph over evil. He's setting this up because here's the other thing, and maybe you've experienced this before. God's delays are not necessarily his way of saying no. His delays are not necessarily his way of saying no. And so for them, don't think that if something hasn't happened in your time, in the time you expect, that God has said no. His timing is always perfect. And his method always differs from yours. Do you ever have that happen? Like you think God's going to do something, and he does it a different way? You ever have that happen? Oh my gosh. That's happened to me numerous times. And you even stop and you plan. And you spend all of this time planning, and it's going to be like this, and it's going to happen this way, and this is the way it's going to go, or whatever. And then all of a sudden it's like, God goes, no. It says in Psalms, man plans his way, but God directs his steps. Right? Last thing, when God intervenes, listen. When God intervenes, it's for his all-surpassing glory and for my ultimate good. When God intervenes, it's for his all-surpassing glory and my ultimate good. You know, there have been so many things here at TNC that we have seen God do over and over and over again. And every single time, I can tell you this without fail, every single time, God did it in such a way that he gets the credit. Every time. Every time. So God intervened in the midst of Elizabeth and Zechariah's hopelessness and set the stage for his intervention into humanity's hopelessness. Okay? And so right after Zechariah could speak again, there's a lot longer part of this, but I just did the last couple phrases of what he said in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 78. Listen to what he says. Because of God's tender mercy, the morning light from heaven is about to break upon us, to give light to those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death, and to guide us into the path of peace. He's saying, look, you need to understand. He's saying, Zechariah is saying, my hope in God has been rekindled. My hope in God has been rekindled. He has now lit a fire, because it was almost out. And he has lit a fire. And he's saying, get he's saying, get ready for the one who's going to bring hope to a world held hostage in darkness. He is about to be born, and Zach knows that his new son John is going to prepare the way for Jesus. He's going to prepare the way for hope. That's going to be Jesus. So, listen. This thing with Jesus bringing hope. You're going to go out, are you? Okay. As we prepare for Christmas, God is asking you to do a heart check. Have you lost hope? Is your hope displaced? Zechariah knew this without a shadow of a doubt after this took place, that his son John was going to prepare the way for the only one who could bring all humanity hope. Because he just experienced it. He's going to provide humanity with hope that'll never fade. So we're going to sing this next song together, okay? As we sing this next song, let's think about that, your hope, because the hope is real. God presented it to Elizabeth and Zechariah in a real way to get it ready for when Jesus came to give us that hope. All right, so let's stand and we'll sing this last song. Those of you on Facebook Live, thanks for joining us tonight. We love our Facebook Live family, and we will see you next week. Have a great week. All right, let's stand. Let's stand.